Hello. So today we're going to talk about John Gardner's novel Grendel. So this is an adaptation, obviously, of Beowulf, in which Grendel is the first of three villains. I say villains, the first of three enemies that Beowulf faces. And Gardner's novel is a prime example of what the scholar Jeremy Rawson calls minor character elaboration, which is a particular postmodern genre that takes characters who, in original canonical works, are peripheral, or we don't really get their story, or they're silenced in some way, or something like this, and it retells these canonical stories from that character's perspective. So this is a first-person narrative from the perspective of Grendel, who in Beowulf is this sort of demon, this monster who lives out in the wilderness, and he's associated with the children of Cain and things like this. We don't, other than this sort of generalized religious or theological basis for Grendel's violent attacks on Hrothgar's kingdom, we don't get that much information about him. So Gardner gives us an extremely complex and developed Grendel, a philosophical Grendel, a Grendel who is thinking about the problems of existence, the meaning of existence, causality, relationality. He's thinking about aesthetics. He's thinking about metaphysics, ontology, epistemology. So this is, it's an extremely philosophical novel, and it's a compact novel, so it does a lot of philosophical work in a very short amount of page space. But we have a Grendel who is philosophically preoccupied with the question of his own existence or his own purpose. We get this basically right from the beginning of the novel. So early on, he actually asserts his intelligence, which is something we don't really see in Beowulf. We get a sense of a sort of mindless evil, a sort of mindless killing machine. But early in the novel, this is almost all sort of thought to himself. He says, "Do not think my brains are squeezed shut like the rams by the roots of horns." Later on, he reflects, "I cannot bear to look." He's looking at or thinking about goats, sheep. So he reflects, "I cannot bear to look. Why can't these creatures discover a little dignity?" I ask the sky. The sky says nothing, predictably. I make a face, uplift a defiant middle finger, and give an obscene little kick. The sky ignores me, forever unimpressed. Him, too, I hate, the same as I hate those brainless budding trees, those prattling birds. Not, of course, that I fool myself with thoughts that I'm more noble. Pointless, ridiculous monster crouched in the shadows, stinking of dead men, murdered children, martyred cows. I'm neither proud nor ashamed, understand. One more dull victim, leering at seasons that never were meant to be observed. So, Grendel is trying to figure out his place and his purpose in the universe, and he ultimately comes to a sort of existentialist conclusion in which he determines that by thinking the world, he creates it, essentially. This is what he determines. And this is a philosophical position that's challenged periodically throughout the novel. It's challenged, for instance, by the dragon, who... The dragon's a really interesting figure, because at one point Grendel does go and see the dragon. And that's the dragon from Beowulf, the third sort of challenge that Beowulf faces over the course of the epic poem. The dragon in a way, the dragon has got a sort of Time Lord thing, where he can see all of existence, he can see all of time, the past, the present, the future, etc., etc. And so the dragon gives Grendel significant advice that challenges Grendel's belief that by thinking the world he creates it, that perception is reality, or perception creates reality. And the dragon, in a way, encourages Grendel to think about things relationally. He encourages Grendel to think about things in terms of what Bruno Latour would call maybe actor network theory. So the interconnections between different things and the impacts that objects and individuals, etc., have on one another in a systemic way. So, for instance, the dragon basically... So Grendel is thinking about the ethics of scaring humans, attacking humans, murdering humans, apart from eating them. Like, if it's sustenance, yeah, that's one thing. But he's not necessarily convinced that it's good to just attack Hrothgar's hall just for the sake of doing it. And the dragon says, "Ah, Grendel," he said, he seemed that instant almost to rise to pity. "You improve them, my boy, can't you see that yourself? You stimulate them. You make them think and scheme. You drive them to poetry, science, religion, all that makes them what they are for as long as they last. You are, so to speak, the brute existent by which they learn to define themselves. The exile, captivity, death they shrink from, the blunt facts of their mortality, their abandonment, that's what you make them recognize, embrace. You are mankind, or man's condition, inseparable as the mountain climber and the mountain. If you withdraw, you'll instantly be replaced. Sorry. Brute existence, you know, are a dime a dozen. No sentimental trash, then. If man's the irrelevance that interests you, stick with him. Scare him to glory. It's all the same in the end. Matter and motion, simple or complex. No difference, finally. Death, transfiguration, ashes to ashes, and slime to slime. Amen." So we have here a sort of philosophy of the moving pieces of the universe leading inexorably to a predetermined fate. And so the question of morality, in a way, becomes irrelevant. The question of, is this good or bad, simply ceases to be. There's almost a sort of Taoist philosophy to what the dragon says, which is that... so the premise of Taoist philosophy, or Chinese philosophy developed by Lao Tzu, is this idea that nature or the universe is moving in a particular direction. You can resist that direction, you can embrace that direction, or you can simply stand apart from it. But inevitably, the universe will go to the place. The universe will go the way that it's going. It will get to the place that it's going to. And whether you resist it, whether you embrace it, whether you're indifferent to it, makes no difference to the universe, makes no difference to nature. And so it doesn't matter it doesn't matter what you do. You don't alter the outcome. You simply choose how you engage with existence. So, I mean, we've got this. It's an interesting complexity of philosophical ideas. And then we've also got a number of other components, a number of other philosophical components that are incorporated into this. One of the big ones being Freudian psychoanalysis. Because Grendel lives in a cave with his mother, Grendel's mother's cave, Grendel's mother being the second major challenge to Beowulf. And interestingly enough, so a lot of Grendel's reflections on his relationship with his mother have these Freudian overtones. So like he says, of all the creatures I knew in those days, only my mother really looked at me, stared at me as if to consume me like a troll. She loved me in some mysterious sense I understood without her speaking it. I was her creation. We were one thing, like the wall and the rock growing out from it. Or, so I ardently, desperately affirmed. When her strange eyes burned into me, it did not seem quite sure. I was intensely aware of where I sat, the volume of darkness I displaced, the shiny, smooth span of packed dirt between us, and the shocking separateness from me and my mama's eyes. I would feel all at once alone and ugly almost, as if I'd dirtied myself, obscene. The cavern river rumbled far below us. Being young, unable to face these things, I would bawl and hurl myself at my mother, and she would reach out her claws and seize me, though I could see I alarmed her. I had teeth like a saw. And she would smash me to her fat, limp breast as if to make me a part of her flesh again. And after that, comforted, I would gradually ease back out into my games. So we've got a lot of Freudian stuff going on here. There are these sort of vaguely sexualized implications here. There's the resentment, the sort of maternal resentment. There's the desire to be one with the flesh of the mother, etc., etc. All of these things that Freud talks about as sort of fundamental to human psychology. But one of the things that's really interesting about this passage and this idea, the sort of difficulties that Grendel experiences in the cave, is that one famous reading of the fight between Beowulf and Grendel's mother, because in that, Beowulf comes down into the cave and his sword melts in the acidity of the cave, or the fires of the cave, or whatever it is. And so one famous Freudian reading of this, which my partner absolutely insists is correct, and I don't disagree, is that the sword is the phallic symbol that wilts in the mother's cave. The stand-in, the symbol for the maternal womb. And so this is one sort of Freudian reading we have here, and Grendel seems to be in that same kind of space, that same kind of difficulty of establishing masculinity, virility, potency, etc., within the space of the maternal womb, the maternal cave. So that's a very interesting component. And again, it's part of this sort of hodgepodge complexity of philosophical systems that Gardner puts into the novel. The other thing that's really interesting is the figure of the shaper. And this is where Gardner really brings in some aesthetic philosophy. So the shaper is the musician, court poet. Hrothgar takes him on. He shows up one night, and Hrothgar sort of hires him essentially as the court singer. So it says, one night, inevitably, and that's an interesting word there, but one night, inevitably, a blind man turned up at Hrothgar's temporary mead hall. He was carrying a harp. So this is interesting that he's blind, because we have another famous blind epic poet, Homer, from the Greeks. But the Shaper shows up and he chants. And he actually chants the opening portion of the Beowulf poem. Lo, we have heard the honor of the Speardanes, nation kings in days gone now, or in days now gone, how those battle lords brought themselves glory. Oft shield sheafing shattered the forces of kinsmen marauders, dragged away their mead hall benches, terrified earls. After first men found him cast away, he got recompense for that. He grew up under the clouds, won glory of men, till all his enemies sitting around him heard across the whale roads his demands and gave him tribute. That was a good king. So this is the opening portion of the Beowulf poem, as it's written down, as the written versions of it record. And so this is again a postmodern gesture, this sort of self-consciousness of the adaptation process. The singer of the Beowulf poem is put into the novel adapting Beowulf. So we have that postmodern self-consciousness there. And Grendel listens to the Shaper's songs. He listens to the poem that, ironically enough, tells his own story, although we don't necessarily know that the whole thing is told, but we get senses of it. And one of the things Grendel says is, I too crept away, my mind a swim in ringing phrases, magnificent, golden, and all of them incredibly lies. What was he? The man had changed the world, had torn up the past by its thick, gnarled roots, and had transmuted it. And they who knew the truth remembered it his way, and so did I. So, again, this is where we get into aesthetic philosophy, this idea that through the arts, through poetry, through fiction, through theater, through painting, we can change the world, or change the way that the world is perceived. So that's what the Shaper does, is he creates these beautiful heroic narratives about the Danes, about Hrothgar's people, and those become the truth, regardless of what had actually happened. And it's really interesting because Gardner is doing something similar. Gardner is re-envisioning, reinterpreting Beowulf to make something new. And it's one of the principles of adaptation theory, one of the things that a lot of scholars of adaptation, including myself, talk about and assert, that once you've encountered an adaptation that challenges the fundamental premises of an earlier text, the way that you encounter that earlier text is forever going to be changed. So because of John Gardner's Grendel, I will never be able to read Beowulf the same way again. I will always be influenced by the way that Gardner conceptualizes the character of Grendel, the character of Hrothgar, the character of Beowulf even.